Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our interview series sponsored by the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy in the run-up to our first ever virtual conference that is scheduled for August 13th through 15th of 2020. We hope that these interviews will whet your appetite for the discussions that we will be hosting in those 3 days, 6 panels, one plenary speaker, one student panel. So get enthusiastic, and we hope that you will come by. We've been interviewing a number of interesting people. We continue interviewing a number of interesting people, all of whom are ASCE members. And you, of course, are also welcome to join the organization if you've got an interest. Today, it's a very special pleasure to welcome from Paris, Michael J. Strauss, who's a professor of international law and international relations at the Centre d'études diplomatiques et stratégiques in Paris, and an invited professor at the Belarusian State University in Minsk. He's also taught international law as an adjunct professor at the Université de Paris, that is Paris Descartes. His research encompasses the relationship between states and territorial control, with a focus on leased territories and the lease of Guantanamo Bay in particular, which is going to be the subject of our discussion today. So we're gearing up for this. Strauss has written 3 books and numerous articles pertaining to leased territories, and a 4th book on privatizations and territorial control that steered him towards his current research on post-government companies and territorial control as a motive in capitalism, which is also a very cool and interesting thing with some application to Cuba. He holds a PhD in international relations and diplomacy from CEDS, and also has degrees from the University of Minnesota and Columbia. Prior to entering academia, he was an award-winning international journalist. Oh my God, now I'm gonna have to be careful. International journalist, mainly focusing on the economy and finance for Dow Jones and Knight Ridder. And he's been a member of ASCE since 2009. And with that, welcome, Professor Strauss. I was wondering if we can start off after the hellos. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you got interested in Cuba studies and leases.
Okay, well, thank you, Larry, for the nice introduction. My life in one paragraph. The whole thing came about actually. It started not from a particular interest in Cuba. It started from an interest in leases of territory between countries, which is what I did when I did my PhD dissertation. The thing I did it on was, can you resolve sovereignty disputes this way? Because there was a case that I knew of between France and Spain that did. When I did the research for this, I found very quickly that nobody had looked at the phenomenon of states leasing their territory to each other for about 100 years or so, ever since the period when Hong Kong was leased and the Panama Canal, and as it turns out, Guantanamo, because that was leased in 1903. In any case, somebody in New York at City University found out I knew something about leases of territory. Their law school was putting on a symposium about Guantanamo, and they needed somebody other than, I suppose, a human rights lawyer to explain what this lease was all about. So they asked me to come, and I talked about, that's when I started looking at the lease at Guantanamo more closely. After the symposium, they asked me to do an article for the law review. So I did that, and I looked even more closely at the lease, and it started to become pretty interesting.
You went down the rabbit hole then.
I'm afraid so, because there was too much information for the article. I had to do a book. So that came later about the lease. In any case, what became abundantly obvious was that this lease at Guantanamo between the United States and Cuba was far more interesting than the ones I did my PhD dissertation about, because it was a very sloppily done, quickly done, very short arrangement that turned out to make Guantanamo kind of a laboratory of American law, of Cuban law, of international law. If you take a look at what the lease says and take a look at what's happening at Guantanamo ever since it was made, they bear no relationship to each other, particularly today. There are ways that they can get around this, procedurally in explaining what they do and say, oh yes, well, we're complying with this and this and this and that in the lease. But on paper, it looks like one thing, and what's going on there looks like completely something else.
Right. Which is a great segue to my first question. And I was hoping that one of the first things, most people know the word Guantanamo, and they know what its uses has been certainly since the Bush II administration. But very few people are very clear about the history of the leasehold at all. And I was wondering if you could just walk us through, how did we get from aiding the Cuban rebels in their fight for victory against the Spanish monarchy and the lease in Guantanamo?
Yeah. Well, to make a long story short, it was actually a short story when you consider wars in general. But in any case, what happened was the U.S. went to war with Spain. The declaration of war in 1898 was conditioned on the fact that the United States would not annex Cuba if it won, that it would make Cuba independent. Well, the United States won so handily that it got all these other Spanish territories as well, in addition to winning Cuba. And at that time, you won a war, you annexed the territory, it was yours. But the US decided with Cuba, no, we weren't going to annex Cuba. They took everything else, but Cuba was in the declaration, as part of the declaration of war. They said, no, we're not going to do that. So they had an obligation to make Cuba independent. But once they won the war, they realized that there weren't Cubans who knew how to run the place as a thriving country with a government, and particularly the way the U.S. wanted it run, because after all, the war was pushed by U.S. investors in Cuba, particularly sugar industry investors, who had much more stake in what was going on there than the Spanish did by the time this was happening. And so, not knowing how to run Cuba was not seen as a good thing for business. So the United States said, okay, we will train a bunch of leaders of the Cuban population on how to govern. Meantime, we'll continue a military government there, while they interacted with various people that it chose to interact with, to put together a government in Cuba. And once they were satisfied that they could do it, they said, okay, now you guys go out and write yourselves a constitution, and if we like it, we'll give you your independence. And that's more or less what they did, except at the last minute, they said, by the way, there's one more thing. We'd like you to add something to your constitution. This is what became known as the Platt Amendment. It was an amendment to a U.S. military spending bill that authorized the U.S. troops to leave Cuba if Cuba complied with all of this stuff. And as part of the Platt Amendment that Cuba was supposed to add to its constitution, which it did as an annex, it required Cuba to sell or lease lands on the island to the United States for purposes of ensuring its independence and all that kind of stuff. The US wasn't stupid. It also required Cuba to make this into a bilateral treaty because they knew as soon as Cuba became independent, they could change the constitution and get rid of this. But with a bilateral treaty, they were sort of stuck. So it was in both places. In any case, that's how the United States managed to get this foothold in Cuba. It was, in a way, out-negotiated by the people they trained to run the government there. Because at the beginning, the United States wanted to have 4 locations in Cuba. Part of it was really to keep an eye on things for the investors, after all. The idea of ensuring its independence was almost an afterthought. But essentially the United States wanted 4 areas, and the new Cuban government, through its negotiators, held them to 2, and it held them to leasing the areas instead of buying them. Now, nobody knew what kind of purchase might have happened. It might have simply been a purchase under Cuban law, or it might have been an actual cession of territory.
Okay, yeah, sovereign purchase, yeah.
But in this case, it was a bilateral lease that was made for 2 areas, Guantanamo in the southeast, and then in the north, a little area called Bahia Honda, that the United States never really used, and it reverted back to Cuba after about a decade. But the lease was made toward the end, well, the lease was made in 1903, and it consisted of 2 documents. One was an executive agreement between the 2 governments, as President Estrada and President Roosevelt just did it between themselves. And that became the framework for the lease. It was added to with a lot of, all the detail was added in a treaty that was ratified by both countries' legislatures later in the year, also in 1903. So the lease was actually comprised of these 2 documents, both of which were pretty vague and created all sorts of problems interpreting it that went on for years, such as the lease, the framework of the lease gave the United States something, the exact wording is complete jurisdiction and control for the time necessary for naval and coaling stations, okay? While both countries recognized that Cuba would have, quote unquote, in English at least, ultimate sovereignty over Cuba would have ultimate sovereignty over Guantanamo, and at the beginning Bahia Honda too. Ultimate, of course, means more than one thing. Ultimate can mean sort of an underlying definitive sovereignty, or it can mean sort of a final, time-oriented sovereignty. One of the mysteries of this lease is that the Spanish version was much clearer. It said soberanía definitiva. Why the US version, the English version, didn't simply say definitive sovereignty, I don't know. There doesn't seem to be anything in the negotiating documents to explain that point, or a lot of other points for that matter. But in any case, that's how the United States got Guantanamo. For the time necessary for coaling or naval stations, and for no other purpose, because the lease said that too. It had to be either a coaling station or a naval station. Now, coaling station, well, that was because all the naval ships used coal at that time. And if the United States was going to project its power by sending its ships out in the world, they didn't want to run out of fuel. So they leased areas around the world, from Hawaii to a little piece on Hawaii to Cuba to various other places, and one in Cuba was Guantanamo, to have these big coal piles. That gave Guantanamo its first problem, really, theoretically, because it wasn't really a problem. Insofar as the Cuban government and the United States government were very friendly toward each other. And so whatever the United States wanted in those days, Cuba said basically, okay. What happened was maybe a decade after they made the leases, after about 1910, the United States said, okay, well, they found enough oil in the US, we think we can convert our naval ships to oil. Before, they didn't want to do that until they knew there was enough. But by 1910, they had found enough, and oil was a much better fuel to use for ships. And so the coaling station at Guantanamo became an oil depot. And Cuba was fine with that. However, that could have had enormous consequences, because when you have a naval base in a foreign country, a naval base becomes a legitimate target during wartime. So an enemy of the United States could legitimately attack Guantanamo, even if Cuba is not involved in the conflict. That's how it works under international law. If the naval base supports the military structure during wartime, it becomes a legitimate target. Well, somebody bombs a pile of coal, and not much is going to happen other than the coal will burn. But if somebody bombs a bunch of oil tanks, there you got all sorts of potential for explosions, disasters, pollution of the water that is not going to stay in the leased area, but is going to flow out into the area that Cuban fishermen use. So you had, this very loose interpretation of coaling station, and it was not until 2004 that the United States Navy, in a technical publication, said, yes, to this day, we abide by the terms of the lease by using Guantanamo as a place for fuel, place to store fuel. Well,
okay, so coal became fuel.
Coal became fuel, which raises a very interesting question, because there are naval ships that happen to run on nuclear fuel. And the United States and Cuba had a slight problem over nuclear things in 1962. So does this mean that the United States might have had at some point, or may still have, nuclear fuel at Guantanamo?
Well, they're certainly not telling us.
They're not going to tell anybody if that happens. I'm sure of that.
Well, let me ask you a question. If I
Yes.
remember correctly, the lease did not remain pure, that is, untouched, after 1903. But indeed, wasn't there an amendment or a series of amendments between 1903 and 1959?
Well, the main thing that happened was the Treaty of Relations in 1934. Because what that did was that got rid of most of the Platt Amendment, most of the other clauses in the Platt Amendment, but it kept this one. It reaffirmed the lease, but it happened to say that the lease would remain in effect until both parties agreed to end it, or the U.S. abandoned the territory. That raised a really interesting question, because what is abandonment in a legal sense? If all the soldiers at Guantanamo decide to go into, say, the town of Guantanamo on a Saturday night for some fun at the bars, did they abandon the base? Do you have to have all of the soldiers stationed there abandon it, or can there be a few left? Anyway, it raised some rather interesting theoretical questions. What constitutes abandonment? And who can do it? Because one of the interesting things about that is under the Obama administration, where there was an effort to normalize relations, Cuba had two demands. One was to get rid of the trade embargo. Okay, that's, that's expected. The other is to give us back control over Guantanamo. And the 1934 Treaty of Relations said how that could be done. One of the ways was abandonment, which means that you don't need any congressional approval in the United States. Because it's a foreign base, it doesn't come under the US government's processes for closing military bases, because closing a foreign base may not be up to the US. There have been cases where in wartime, in Southeast Asia, military bases were abandoned by the decision of the commander at the base. So it could end up being a decision at a level that low. Anyway, because the framework agreement was also an executive agreement back in 1903, it could be argued that the lease could end also by executive agreement. There are all sorts of ways that the United States could give control of Guantanamo back to Cuba without going through the United States Congress. Abandoning, doing a new executive agreement, and a couple of other things, a couple of other options. Did Cuba have any hope that this would happen? Not that I could tell.
This is after 1959, I'm assuming.
Yes, yes, of course. Things changed a little bit in 1959. And Cuba has wanted control of Guantanamo back ever since. It actually would have loved to have it before then. But, friends are friends. Actually, the fact that the United States was there through World War II probably was a benefit for Cuba. It didn't have to spend any money on defending that part of the island in case anybody thought of attacking it. So, there were certain benefits in the employment area as well, because Guantanamo, the US base, was the biggest employer of Cubans in that whole area. So, up until 1959 and even after, they continued to employ a number of Americans. In any case, after 1959, Cuba said it wanted control of Guantanamo back. So this became, during the Obama administration, this became a way to try to get it back. And the Obama administration could have done it without going through Congress. The fact that it didn't, it never explained why it didn't do this. It would have been one of the easier ways to satisfy, probably certainly a easier way than ending the embargo, to satisfy at least one of Cuba's demands. There was the little matter of the prison and the prisoners who were still there. But if the United States abandoned Guantanamo, the prisoners would become Cuba's problem.
Right. But here's a question: did the treaty permit the Americans to convert the use of the leased lands for a prison of this type for prisoners of war, or did it matter as long as they maintained at least part of the facility, or the principal purpose of it was to maintain a naval base or a fueling station that they can then do whatever else they wanted on the within the leased territory? Was that ever an issue?
Yeah, the way they managed to do this, was, remember in 1903, the lease said that the United States could use Guantanamo as a coaling station or a naval station and nothing else. A naval station was the narrowest form of naval facility. The broadest form was a full-fledged naval base. And over the years, up until the 1950s, the United States did expand from a naval station all the way up to a naval base in 1952. And Cuba went along with that because it felt that for whatever reasons, either friendship with the United States, perhaps looking the other way for certain kinds of corruption that was going on, who knows what, Cuba agreed to all of this stuff.
Right. So there was at least a history of acquiescence.
There was an almost complete history of acquiescence up until 1959. And even since 1959, Cuba has never really brought, it said the lease is invalid. It tried to argue that for a while. It said it's void, and it actually gave various reasons why it's void. But it never did anything in any legal way to go after trying to get the United States out, which raises some interesting questions. Why not? Well, it did turn out that Guantanamo became the place where the United States and Cuba had informal relations all the way through the period where there were no formal diplomatic relations.
So it was literally a back door.
It was a back door, and it started out because the commander of the base and the local officials in the Cuban towns around it had common interests. If there was a forest fire or an animal disease or something that was just happening locally, or a medical situation where they might have needed each other's resources, they worked things out locally. This became an institutionalized monthly meeting in which people from Washington would fly down and people from Havana would fly down, and it involved military as well as civilian people. And it became a place where relations continued under the radar, literally under the radar, because they had the radar there. But where negotiations and other things went on. As far as the prison, that's one of those things that didn't quite fit with the definition of what happens on a naval station, and it certainly didn't fit with what happens at a coaling station. So how could that happen? Well, the United States it's up to the United States to define what happens at a naval station. It was terminology that was in the lease, but it was created by the United States in terms of its own categorizing of military bases. And it allowed at some later point for naval stations to have what they call tenant commands, so that some other branch of the US Armed Forces could be a tenant of the Navy at a naval station. And that's how the prison got there.
Okay, so it was
legal structure.
It was dependent on the definition by the American military of the way in which you operate this thing, which under the basis of the US-Cuba Treaty was called a naval facility or a naval station.
Precisely.
So the Americans would supply the guts of the meaning of this thing, and the treaty basically just provided a kind of capstone beneath which it was and then by redefining this and allowing people to lease the Marines, the Army, but does that include things like the CIA?
Yes, whatever the tenant wants to do, it can do. As long as
would it include something like McDonald's?
Yes, indeed. Well, I mean, there's some weird things that happened, because when I visited Guantanamo in 2008, when I was doing research for the book on the lease. They gave me permission, and so I went. And one of the odd things that comes out of this arrangement where you have a tenant command or a tenant of the naval base, and the tenant being other US military and government facilities like the prison, is that at the time I was there, the commander of the naval base was a captain. And the commander of the tenant facility was an admiral. And so you had, in a strange sort of way, an admiral reporting to a captain in terms of ensuring that things happened, like the infrastructure. It was all very weird. There was another element of the lease that was actually in the treaty. That was the second part of the lease that gave all the detail, that essentially prohibited private enterprise from existing at Guantanamo. The lease said that the United States will not have any commercial enterprise at Guantanamo. Now, why the US agreed to something like that, nice capitalist country like the United States, why would it agree to that? Well, first of all, why would it even come up? Because a military base in 1903 was 100%, everybody worked for the government. Everything that was done there was the government. It was a perfect socialist environment. Most likely, the Cuban merchants in the surrounding towns didn't want any competition. Because, you know, in those days, people could come on and off the base. The Cuban workers would come on and the soldiers would go off to the bars and things like that. And so most likely this came about because of requests or demands by the Cuban merchants, who stood to lose a lot of business if the big populated base had its own commercial activities.
Right. Became closed off.
Yeah.
Right.
So for the US in those days, they didn't have any idea that anything in a naval base could be a private enterprise. So they agreed to it, and it was kind of a throwaway agreement because they were agreeing not to do something they wouldn't have done anyway, have private enterprise at Guantanamo. So how do you explain the fact that today there is a McDonald's at Guantanamo, there are other fast food joints, you have all sorts of private contractors, anything that's built at Guantanamo gets built by private contractors, the electricity supplies, the telephones, the internet, everything is provided under contract now. Even the garbage gets picked up by a private contractor. Well, what happened was, after the Vietnam War, the US government decided, we got to save some money. And there was an effort to privatize as many ancillary activities of the military across the board as they could. So the Pentagon embarked on this big privatization program. Whatever they could contract out, they would contract out. Nobody stopped to think that Guantanamo was the one place where it was prohibited, where private enterprise was prohibited. You couldn't contract. I mean, it was counterintuitive for a capitalist system to say, okay, well, this is one place where you can't do it out of, you know, the hundreds of bases it had in the United States and elsewhere in the world. So the United States went ahead and did it. Now, prior to the Cuban Revolution, every time the United States wanted to derogate from that clause in the treaty, it made an agreement with the Cuban government.
Okay.
It took it seriously, and so did the Cuban government. If it wanted to have telegraph cables laid, which it did in the 1920s, it made a derogation agreement with the Cuban government so that the private enterprise could come onto the base and deal with, establish the links. There was one commander at one point that allowed a shop to open at the base, and the subsequent commander closed it down after hearing from Cuba about it, saying, no, this violates the agreement. So people took it seriously until the revolution. After the revolution, and particularly after the break off of diplomatic relations, there was no channel to ask for derogation. These informal talks didn't start until years later. So the United States just kind of did what it wanted to do. When it started privatizing things throughout the military, Guantanamo was caught up in that as well. And that's how you ended up with private enterprise there.
Amazing.
Now, I'll tell you, when I was there, I was told that there was going to be a soldier meeting me with this little in this little airplane that I was on when it landed there. I took at that time they're not allowed to fly there anymore, but there was a little airline called Air Sunshine, and I thought, well, that sounds like a nice airline. I didn't know it had 50-year-old small planes that were falling apart, but nonetheless, I got there, and I was told that there would be a soldier to take my mobile phone. And I thought it was for security reasons, because after all, people say you can blow things up by mobile phones, sending the signal. I thought, okay, no problem. Well, the plane landed. There were 7 or 8 government contractors that got out, and me. And the public affairs officer, who was going to be kind of my minder there, and his wife, they met me at the airstrip. We were waiting for this soldier to come by to take my mobile phone so that my minder and his wife could take me to the place I was going to stay. Well, it turned out that nobody came to take my mobile phone, and my minder said, well, we better take the last ferry off from the airstrip to the other side of the bay, because that's where you'll be staying, and if you're stuck here, there's no place to sleep. So we went, and I kept my phone. We got to the place I was going to stay. It was a place called the Combined Bachelor's Quarters, which is sort of a fancy apartment complex where government contractors, dignitaries, people like that stay. I think they liked the fact that I was an academic and not a journalist in those days, particularly because the prison was going full blast and all the journalists wanted to know about was the prison. I wanted to know about the territory. So they put me up in this place. And my minder said, okay, I'll pick you up at 5:30 in the morning so we can go to the mess building and have breakfast. I thought, 5:30 in the morning? Yeah, the military's early. Okay, well, I thought, okay. Next to my bed was this alarm clock. But this alarm clock was this enormous box that did about 20 or 30 other things too. And I was not so confident that I would be able to figure out, after being tired from a long trip, how to set this thing up to get woken up in time to be picked up at 5:30 in the morning. And then I realized I still have my mobile phone. So I turned it on. I set the alarm on the mobile phone, which I always use. And I put the phone next to the bed. And I went to sleep. 5 o'clock in the morning, phone goes off. Perfect. But then I noticed something on the phone. there's a network. It's connected to a network that said CU at the end of it. And I thought, Cuban network. I wonder if this is allowed. Maybe, or is it breaking the embargo if I use it? I don't know. I didn't use it. Though my minder came by in his car 5:30 as planned, and I showed this to him. I said, "Is this a Cuban network?" And he said, "Yeah." Don't show that to anybody.
Yeah. There you go. There you go. Well, it is time to wrap this up, and I'd love to talk to you some more. This has just been fabulously interesting, and maybe if we have popular demand, I will bring you back and we can do some more chatting about Guantanamo and leases. There's still a lot of unexplored territory.
We barely scratched the surface.
So I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you again for your kindness in letting us intrude on your day and to chat with us a little bit about Guantanamo. Really appreciate it. And I know that you will be at our conference, and I hope that our listeners will as well. And we will, I promise we will chat some more about Guantanamo. So again, thank you very, very much.
Okay, well, Larry, thank you. You didn't know what you were going to get into when you asked a simple question. I suppose
there's no such,
I didn't either, but
right. There's no such thing.
That's the beauty of what we're doing live, but what other people will see when it's not live.
That's right. So again, thank you very much, and we will see you again.
Okay, and thank you.